I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex. I'm here with António Guterres, who of course is the Secretary General of the United Nations. As you can tell from the surroundings, we're actually in the United Nations in the Secretariat building in New York. And we're here during the UN General Assembly, which is a period when the development community descends on Manhattan. And obviously the global focus within the development community is right here on all the proceedings that take place. So we wanted to take a moment of your time, Mr. Secretary General, to understand what is your message to the development community? What is different about this year, about the General Assembly in 2018, that we should all be paying attention to?
I think that it is clear that we have clear goals, but it's clear we are not doing enough to reach those goals. And this is true for the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. All the indications we have are in the sense that we are making progress, but not enough.
Yes. Targets
will not be reached as they were planned. And on the other hand, climate change is running faster than what we are, and we are sincerely at risk of creating an irreversible situation in which the objectives, the targets defined in the Paris Agreement will not be reached. So my essential message is of sense of urgency, of gathering political will, because to a large extent it is political will, namely in relation to climate change, but also in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, and at the same time to strengthen the partnerships that are necessary to make it happen. With the governments not sufficiently implicated in climate change, the role of cities, of businesses, and, of the civil society, of states is becoming more and more important. And at the same time, it is clear that the Sustainable Development Goals will not be reached just by government action or by official development aid. Either we are able to create the conditions to fully engage societies in general, the business community in general, or we will of course make progress, but we will not really correspond to what was the ambition expressed by all the heads of state and government when they approved the Agenda 2030.
Now, a big part of your focus on achieving those SDGs is the reform that you initiated at the UN. My understanding is it begins in January of 2019. A lot of the discussion during this General Assembly is about that reform. So let's connect it to the SDGs. You're going to create these new resident coordinators in every country, taking them away from the UNDP portfolio that they used to kind of co-manage. How will they direct the kind of urgency you just described around the SDGs at the country level? Do you expect them to have a strong voice on that?
I think it was clear that the UN of course, it depends on country by country, it depends on the quality of people involved, and in many situations I think people are working very well. It's not the fact that you have perfect structures that means that things go well. It's with perfect people that things go well, even if the structure is not so good. But it is true that we have severe problems of coordination. We have severe problems of focusing the whole of the UN to achieve the sustainable development, or to support member states to achieve the sustainable development goals. There was a certain trend of each one doing what is more or less linked to each one's activities without that common perspective. Because sustainable development goals are not like the Millennium Development Goals, that were 8 specific things dealt separately. Now this is a comprehensive development strategy. We need all to work together to support member states much more effectively. So there is a question of coordination, there is a question of transparency and accountability. And we tried to have, from the General Assembly, support to an enhanced coordination mechanism, bringing the resident coordinators to the direct dependency of the Secretary General and giving them a stronger role in the country teams. We need to review how the country teams are organized and establish mechanisms of cooperation among the different agencies in line with the priorities defined by the government, much more effective. And we need to have much more transparency and accountability. And not only accountability on each one does, but accountability on the whole of system performance. On the other hand, we try to obtain a form of guaranteed funding for this process. Unfortunately, that was not possible to achieve. There was the opposition of, namely, the United States and Russia that made it impossible. And so we are struggling to get the resources that are necessary to put the new system into place. And we hope we will be able to do it. And we will, in any case, move forward.
You will, okay.
But probably not with the full capacity we would like to have.
Because you were looking to really create a whole new set of positions by having a new UNDP head as well as a resident coordinator.
And also to have a stronger mechanism here of the so-called DOCO, the department that being much more able to provide support to the country teams. And at the same time, as we are reforming also the peace and security sector, and we are valuing enormously the role of peace building, the Peace Building Support Office and the Peace Building Fund, to try to establish a more clear link about between what the country teams do and also what our peace and security sector does. And sometimes it is true that we have seen it in the Sahel. Sure. There was, of course, a peace and security approach to the Sahel. There were missions, Mali, in other countries. There are regional envoys. And then there were the country teams. And we had 18 different UN programs of support to the Sahel development. Now we were able to bring all this together. We have an Assistant Secretary General coordinating the whole of the effort. So we need not only to have country teams that are more effective, better coordinated, more accountable, more transparent, but also better integrated with our regional commissions, better integrated with the other pillars of the activities of the UN, both the human rights pillar and the peace and security pillar.
How much are these really internal changes? For example, if you look at the SDGs, you look at many of the development indicators, many of them are actually doing quite well, but the area of freedom, of open civil society is kind of reversing. Freedom House's index says we're the 12th year in the row where the world is less free. At the local civil society level, when I talk to NGO leaders, they say, well, we don't hear the voice of the UN in many situations. Should we expect these resident coordinators, now that they're elevated in their role, to speak out more forcefully?
One of the development goals, as you know, Goal 16, is exactly linked to the questions of governance, to the questions of the role of civil society, to the questions of transparency and accountability also at country level. And it is clear for me that with these more effective coordination and better linkage between the three pillars of activity of the UN, development, peace and security, and human rights, we will be able, hopefully, to do better in relation to these aspects, and to also to have a better articulation. The UN has many bodies. We don't all need to do the same thing, but we need to converge in our efforts to make sure, namely, that one of the objectives that you mentioned, that the shrinking space for civil society, which is a major concern I have, is reversed. We live in a world where we see new forms of authoritarianism, where we see problems with the free press, where we see problems with the civil society space, and it is clear that development will be better and will even be faster if you have vibrant civil societies working closely with governments, and if you have the mechanisms of transparency within countries that allow for better governance. I was very strongly influenced by Habermas, the German philosopher, and one of his key ideas is that the essential in a modern democracy is the permanent interflow of communication between the political society and the civil society, and the fact that that flow of communication has an impact on political decisions. It's not only elections every 4 or 5 years. And so the strengthening of the role of civil society and the vibrant nature of that civil society is, in my opinion, an extremely important condition for the success of the Sustainable Development Goals.
It is, and it is under some threat in many parts of the world, as you say.
Yes.
I wonder, just going back to the money, you talked about how it's been a challenge to raise the funds for this new system. So much of the money in the UN system is in the independent agencies. And I know initially when you talked of reform, there was some concern. You know, they like their independence. Has that been ironed out? Do the independent agencies who raise their own funds feel under this system of coordination, they'll retain the autonomy that they so much value?
We had a very open dialogue with the agencies, but also with the boards of the agencies. Mm-hmm. And I must say that I'm seeing it probably for the first time in the UN, a total consistency about what member states say in the General Assembly and what they are saying in the boards of the different agencies.
You're not hearing a different message behind closed doors.
Quite reassuring. And I am also very happy with the very positive attitude of my colleagues. I was myself a head of an agency, right, so I know exactly the problems that exist and the difficulties that exist. I think that we are creating the basis for a very solid cooperation. And one thing I want to say, I fully respect their mandates. Mm-hmm. I mean, the question here is not a question of establishing a hierarchical structure, because that would undermine our effectiveness. Mm-hmm. Diversity is a richness, not a threat. This is true for ethnic or religious diversity, but it is also for organizational diversity. We need to take profit of all diversity of the system, but we need to make sure that the diversity leads to convergence and not to competition that obviously would undermine our effort to support member states when we have a clear target to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, and when we know that we are too slow in reaching that target.
Another area where we need that kind of coordination could be the humanitarian aid sector. Back when you ran UNHCR.
But I have to say that I believe that if there is an area where the UN is better organized, is probably the humanitarian sector.
Okay.
I think that in relation to the humanitarian work of the UN, the different agencies, the role of OCHA, I think that today there is a quite effective coordination. Nothing is perfect, but also a very good articulation with the civil society. I remember UNHCR had more than 800 partners in the civil society, and we looked at that partnership not as a kind of, service provider partnership, but as a strategic partnership, especially with those NGOs that had a stronger presence and a stronger role in the humanitarian family. And I believe that if there is an area where the UN on one side and the whole of the community, Red Cross, Red Crescent system with the ICRC and the Federation, NGO movements, if there is an area where I believe we are more effective is in the humanitarian field.
Now we're 3 years past the World Humanitarian Summit, the Grand Bargain. At that point you had said when you were running UNHCR that you thought the humanitarian system was kind of at a breaking point. How do you assess where we are now? It sounds like you feel the coordination is strong.
If you look at, for instance, our response to the threat of famine, I was quite amazed with the excellent cooperation among agencies and the excellent cooperation of the agencies with, for instance, international financial institutions, the World Bank. Today the cooperation with the World Bank and the IMF is much better than ever in the past. And also a stronger connection with the NGO movement. So I do believe that the challenges, of course, have grown immensely, especially in the conflict area. Situation in Syria, Yemen, etc. But the humanitarian community has been able to respond, not to solve the problems, not to do everything that is needed, that would be completely impossible, but to respond better than what people would suppose if one looks at security challenge, if one looks at the difficulties of access, if one looks at the combination of factors, conflicts, climate change, social inequality.
So there's been improvement in your mind in
I
these
believe
years since
that
the summit.
the system has proved able to respond, even if obviously we could always do better. And in other areas we are struggling much more. Peacekeeping is an area where we are now very committed to reform, and it's clear we are facing much more difficulties to do peacekeeping where there is no peace to keep than in relation to humanitarian aid, where with all the difficulties that we have, I think the whole of the international community has been able to respond better than many would expect.
You've mentioned climate a couple of times now, and I wanted to ask you about the Green Climate Fund and the kind of financing structures around climate. It feels like we were losing a lot of momentum in that area. Is this something you plan to focus on in this GA?
We are naturally respecting the autonomy of the bodies, but we are worried with what has happened in the Green Climate Fund, and we hope that the situation will be overcome until the end of the year, beginning of next year, but there is a problem there. There has been a lot of important movement in the private sector, the financial sector. We have green bonds that are proving quite successful, and we would like to have the Sustainable Development Goals bonds as successful, and we are not yet there, as you know. The green bonds, we have seen a movement like that, and in the Sustainable Development Goals bonds, we are still in the first phase. But we have seen a lot of innovation in relation to funding for climate action. We have seen the private sector responding very well. I think the main problem now is political will from the government side. We still have lots of subsidies given to fossil fuels. We still have no adequate carbon pricing. We still have investments in infrastructure that are not friendly to climate action. And we are slow in many aspects, and that is why we are convening the summit for next year and raising the alarm and saying it's absolutely essential that the Paris Agreement is implemented, and it's absolutely essential to increase the ambition. And when in 2020 governments will present their commitments, those commitments need to be much stronger than those presented in the past, because it is clear that the reality is worse than the predictions that science had made, and we are not acting as quickly as it was expected in Paris.
You've mentioned the private sector. There still is a sense, when I talk to major corporate leaders that want to partner with the UN, that they're still too often seen as vendors rather than partners. And I wonder if you have a thought about that. Is that part of the mandate around this UN reform, or around your role at leading the institution?
We are making a huge effort to support the Global Compact, and really to use the Global Compact to change that relationship, and to base that relationship in a true partnership based on the idea that is obvious, that without the involvement of the private sector, and in many areas without the leadership of the private sector, the Sustainable Development Goals will never be reached. It's a matter of scale. I mean, if companies, businesses, the financial sector are not strongly involved, it will be impossible to do it just in many countries with government action or with the official development aid. It's clear that that is far from being enough.
One of the places where private sector plays a big role are NCDs. You have a high-level meeting happening during this GA. What are your expectations for that meeting? Do you have any call to action for that group that's gathering on the 27th?
In relation to the private sector, what we want is for the private sector to more and more put pressure on governments, to be our ally in the advocacy. Because the private sector has already detected that green business is the good business. But they still face a number of obstacles from regulations or from administration or whatever, from government side. So we need to have the private sector even more engaged. And on the other hand, I think it's very important that we have a serious dialogue on what needs to be done in the energy transformation, in the transportation transformation, in agriculture, what needs to be done in order to make the Paris Agreement implementable in its targets. The less than 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degree as the limit. And unfortunately, the risk, as I said, is that at a certain moment we will reach a situation in which irreversibly this will not be possible, because the CO2 remains there. I mean, we cannot then go there and take it out. And so it's absolutely essential now to have a very strong focus on the reduction of emissions.
And thinking about global health and non-communicable disease specifically, do you have is there any sense in your mind that we are at a special moment, you know, and this high-level meeting that's coming? I think there is a growing
consciousness that this approach, malaria, HIV/AIDS, in which lots of action is taking place, but sometimes taking people out of the national services of the different countries that are very fragile. I think that the time for this kind of multiplicity of different initiatives is coming to an end, and I think that now fundamentally we need to strengthen the capacity of states to build health sectors that work and that are able to achieve, to reach out to all the areas of the country. And of course, non-communicable diseases are an extremely important objective, because if the system is able to deal with them, instead of just moving everything to the epidemic areas that of course are more sensational in the way they are able to attract attention, I think if we really are able to put the essential part of our effort in building national systems that respond to the health problems in general, and non-communicable diseases are of course at the center of that, I think that we will be doing the right thing. And I feel that this is the new trend, and the World Health Organization is clearly moving in that direction. And then there is an element that I think is the less invested, the more forgotten, and that we need to put in the center of our concerns is mental health. The level of suffering due to mental health in the world is really completely underestimated by all analyses that I've been reading in relation to the health sector in general.
We're basically out of time, but I just want to ask you one last question about your leadership on the Me Too movement. because you have had a strong voice on this. I think it was in May in the UK, you convened all the chiefs of the UN agencies, including World Bank and WHO and IMF, and really pledged to increase efforts around ending sexual harassment and assault within the UN system. I want to give you a chance to talk about that commitment and where you are in that effort.
That's essential. I mean, in the Secretariat, we have put in place a hotline for people confidentially, not telling necessarily who they are, to be able to consult and to know what are the best instruments at their level. Our biggest problem was the lack of credibility in investigation systems and the slow pace of investigations, because the investigation in the UN was essentially linked to fraud and to other things, not to sexual harassment. So we have created a special unit in our investigation body with 6 investigators, 5 women and 1 man, specialized on, that were recruited, specialized on sexual harassment, and with targets to bring the investigations to a much more short period, and to have the investigation centered on the victim, because victims sometimes had enormous difficulties in accessing and in interacting with investigation systems. And we are asking all agencies to do the same or to rely on the Secretariat new system. At the same time, we have intensified the training. I think we have reached already, if I'm correct, 18,000 of people with access to our training program in sexual harassment. And we are creating mechanisms of exchange of information. For instance, it was in the past usual that someone would be kicked out of an agency and then 5 years afterwards recruited by another one. Now we are sharing the data in order to make sure that this doesn't happen. And we could go on and on with a number of measures that are being taken. I'm really committed. Whistleblower protection is, of course, a new system that I believe is adequate. At least it was discussed with the staff, and we tried to do to use the best practices that were known. So this is something that I take very seriously. But again, these questions are essentially a question of power. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. Well, and that is why, if it is a question of power, the most important instrument to change it is gender parity. And this is the center of our gender policy, and we are reaching results. We have achieved it at top level, but a long way to go.
Well, especially in international institutions where there are visas, residency requirements, it creates a higher barrier that women can't simply speak out or quit easily and move to another role.
Today we have more women than men in resident coordinated system, more women than men in our senior management group, and each department has a program to achieve gender parity up to 2028. And so, and we are very focused on making sure that those programs are implemented, even if we have a number of difficulties. And just to give you examples of difficulties that exist, the retirement age was postponed. So a lot of people now are being retained in the system for a few more years. That doesn't help. But I mean, there's nothing I can do.
These are realities you are
And for instance, some of the rules, when you have a downsizing, permanent contracts have priority, which is normal, but permanent contracts are the old ones, in which there is usually a male dominance. So, I mean, we have lots of obstacles, but we are determined to achieve our goal.
I think that message is loud and clear. I want to thank you again for taking time to speak to the Devex community. This is an important moment for the global development community. We are certainly paying attention to all that you are doing here during the General Assembly. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.